What do you mean by pursued economy?
This whole idea came from my own upbringing. I was born in Japan, and that was 1954. Japan was still a very poor country and recovering from the war. Then 1967, I moved to San Francisco. And wow, 1967, America was beautiful. San Francisco was absolutely beautiful. But only 10 years later, Japanese companies start basically beating the American companies left and right. Then the Japanese are there at the top of the world until Taiwanese and South Korean companies came in. And then the Chinese companies are coming.
Yes.
And I see this pattern and says, wow, why is these things happening? There must be some theory behind it. Even though that is happening, policymakers in most of the advanced countries who are now all pursued economies, in my view, Japan, Europe, United States, their policy thinking is still based on the assumption that the return on capital is highest in your own country. But the fact is that that is no longer the case.
Yes.
All of these things are not addressed because we haven't thought in that kind of terms.
Yes.
And that's why I decided to write this book.
Let's talk something about China. You know, you coined the phrase, the balance sheet recession,
Yes.
which made you very famous in the past 2 to 3 years here in China, because people saw a lot of similarities between China today and Japan at that time. So how do you say the similarities and maybe some differences?
Yes, okay. I think people are seeing the similarities because the real estate bubble burst. And once the real estate bubble burst and people realized that they were chasing what I call wrong asset prices, unsustainable asset prices, which was exactly the same in Japan 34 years ago. If people no longer think the price will continue to go up, might actually go down, then you don't want to be borrowing too much money because your liabilities here, the asset prices will be going down. But when that happens in a very large scale, even though individually people making the correct decisions, but collectively the economy could get killed. But once a big nationwide asset price bubble bursts, so many people will be repairing balance sheets by paying down debt, even at zero interest rates. And very few people will be borrowing money. So then you have a situation where even at zero interest rates, so many people are saving money, so few people are borrowing money. And once you enter that world, the economy could start weakening very, very rapidly. Japanese took 20 years to really come out of this mess. And that's exactly what happened to the United States after the Great Depression. When the New York stock market collapsed October 1929, everybody started repairing balance sheets all at the same time. No one was borrowing money. And the United States lost 46% of its GDP in just 4 years. When you are in that situation, you cannot tell the private sector, please borrow money, because they're all doing the right things, paying down debt. So if you cannot tell the private sector to change their behavior, government has to come in and borrow and spend.
So what's the difference between China and Japan at that time?
Everyone in China knows about balance sheet recession, including you. That's a huge advantage China has over Japan 34 years ago. So if government acts on it, okay, this is balance sheet recession, government should be the borrower of last resort, borrower and spender of last resort to keep the economy going, then average people may never feel balance sheet recession because the economy will be maintained. That was not the case in Japan 34 years ago.
So you mean China now is in kind of balance sheet recession, you mentioned?
Well, I do hear that people are not borrowing money anymore. Some people are beginning to pay down debt. That's probably a smaller portion of the population than what happened in Japan 34 years ago. And one part that is not in China's favor relative to Japan 34 years ago was that the Japanese bubble was really just a bubble. But in the Chinese case, construction industry had a huge boom over the years, and it's now, 26% of China's GDP. And now the construction is down very sharply, which means that industry is shrinking very rapidly, I would imagine. But that will hit the GDP directly. So compared to Japan, which was just a balance sheet problem, China has a balance sheet problem, probably smaller than in Japan, but they have a big construction problem. And the two together could be quite challenging for the Chinese government.
You said that the balance sheet recession typically happens after the bursting of a bubble. And, this time, China pre-called the property bubble consciously.
Yes.
Which means they do it on purpose.
Right.
So do you think, is that the right thing to do?
Well, the right thing to do, now we know after the fact, was never let the bubble happen.
Yes.
Because the Japanese bubble was also pricked by the government. But once the bubble burst, we never thought that repairing balance sheets could take 20 years. And if they had known that in advance, I'm sure Japanese government have taken very many different policies in addition to pricking the bubble. And so I would like to think that Chinese government, realizing that there is a disease called balance sheet recession, will pick public works projects very carefully, because this is not a 1 or 2 year issue. It could be 5-7 year issue. So if that's long, you better pick the good projects, so that 5 or 7 years later, you have a public works project that is really helpful for the Chinese economy.
I think your prescription to address the problem of balance sheet recession is quite straightforward, I think. It's just someone else stepping to borrow, the government. So from this regard, do you think our government, our authorities, what our government doing is enough?
That all depends on how the private sector is reacting. If the private sector is really saving, let's say 10% of GDP, and companies are not borrowing that much, then the government has to borrow the remaining part to keep the economy going. And the fact that Chinese government bond yield is down to 2.4% suggests to me that there's too much savings relative to borrowings. Mm-hmm. And if that's the case, we should listen to the market, the bond market. Mm-hmm. And if the bond market tells you that everybody's buying government bonds because the private sector is not borrowing money, then that means government has to borrow money.
Another argument is if the government spends late, it will probably have to spend more.
Right.
Right.
So sooner the better. If the government does nothing, you could end up in the 1,900, 810, 730, that scenario. And you don't want to get into that one. Mm-hmm. So that's why sooner the better.
We're living in a very different world, so pure orthodox monetary policy may not work today. So from that regard, what are the right combination to cure Chinese economic woes today?
When we were going through schools, we were taught how effective monetary policy is. When I moved to Japan and saw what happened after 1990, I must say that what we were taught in schools, how effective monetary policy could be, was incomplete at best. Because the professors never told us that for monetary policy to work, there has to be plenty of borrowers out there. If there are no borrowers, monetary policy is completely irrelevant.
Yes.
And we found that in Japan first, and we also found that after 2008 in Europe and United States as well. Borrowers all disappeared because they're all repairing balance sheets after the housing bubble collapsed.
So you mean in China today, fiscal policy is the key?
It is the key, I think.
It is the key.
Yeah.
Do you think today we will use more fiscal power to revive the economy?
I will recommend that very strongly. And if the government comes in and says, okay, we're going to do this fiscal policy, and we're going to keep this fiscal policy until the private sector balance sheets are repaired, then the private sector will feel very safe.
Yes.
Then many people might actually spend more, or even invest more, or borrow more.
It could change the sentiment, maybe.
Exactly. And that's basically what Chinese government did in 2008.
But the question is, the package has a lot of hangover today.
Exactly. That's the part that we have to be careful this time.
Yes.
So my recommendation is that do what China did in November 2008. That is to say, a big package to comfort people. And then once people get excited and they start thinking positively, and economies start recovering, then you cut the package so that this excess that we saw in 2011, 12, that will be contained. That would be my recommendation.